Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today, but we do need to start with a disclaimer, which, based on the response we've gotten, is probably not all that necessary, Jim. I thought about saying today that there was a dramatic moment at our staff meeting with Trump on Friday where Jim Roberts and Jack Fowler said, "From our cold, dead hands, you'll get our companies." But ultimately, it was an April Fool's edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Donald Trump is not buying us. Hillary Clinton is not off the hook. And Nevada voters have not changed in our estimation.
Most, I don't know about you, Greg, most of the responses that I got were in the, like, I was kind of fooled for the first one. I thought it might be true. One listener had said he was very disappointed because he thought this meant that, that Donald Trump had now finally gone insane.
Yes.
And I would say, look, just because it's not true doesn't mean that theory isn't necessarily going to come to pass. But no, yeah, all correct. Most people, almost everybody figured it out. So.
Yes, it's always good to, on a moment like that to have, oh, man, I was Googling and then I finally figured it out. So that means we did a pretty good job, but you guys all figured it out. We have the smartest audience in podcasting. So I hope everybody enjoyed that. Back to actual real stories today and on to the Good Martini. And Jim, we have a convention coming up. Could be a contested convention, could not be a contested convention, but it's coming up in July in Cleveland. And there's a lot of stories out there right now about Ted Cruz, his campaign actually bothering to read the rules about delegate selection, particularly when it comes to those who are uncommitted delegates. And they're also doing a good job in states where the delegates are committed but can change their minds on subsequent ballots at the convention. So Ted Cruz is trying to find people who could support him on a second ballot and beyond in places like Arizona, where Donald Trump won all the delegates. He also, of course, worked the system well to end up with more delegates in Louisiana, even though Trump ended up with a plurality of the vote in the primary. We heard about him doing well with delegates in North Dakota and Colorado over the weekend. So, as you point out in the Jolt today, these state conventions are going to matter a lot, particularly if nobody gets to 1237. One campaign is bothered to read the rules. Another campaign is simply accusing the other of trying to steal the nomination.
One of the things that jumps to mind is how many years, Greg, have we had years where the nominee is pretty much selected by the time it gets to the state of Virginia or a whole bunch of states? Usually that by the end of South Carolina's primary, you have a pretty good idea of who the nominee is going to be. Last cycle, Florida really was kind of decisive in ending the Gingrich bid, and then it was kind of just Santorum limping along, trying to catch up to Romney. Look, if this plays out the way we expect, just about every state will, every Republican voter in every state will be casting a meaningful vote. So that's the one good thing, is that for the entire weekend, the eyes of the political world were focused on North Dakota. When's the last time that happened? And it was over, not just over a primary or a caucus, but in this case, the state convention. Now, people are saying, well, wait a second. I thought once you vote the delegates get allocated, and that's how it works. Well, it's not quite the way it works. Different states have different rules, but the gist generally is just, the primary or the caucus determines who gets how many delegates, but who actually gets sent. In other words, the identity of the delegates gets decided at usually some sort of, county party conventions, district party conventions, and state party conventions, depending on the state. In the case of like Iowa, some of them get selected at the congressional district level. Some of them get selected at the state level. They go to Cleveland. They go to the Republican convention, and they're bound to a certain number of ballots. In a lot of states, they're only bound on the first ballot, meaning if you are sent there as a Ted Cruz supporter, you have to vote for Ted Cruz on that first ballot. But after that, you can vote for whoever you want. And yes, this occurs for Donald Trump supporters as well. And what's really intriguing is that Ted Cruz and his campaign have figured out that you don't stop working after primary day. It matters who goes to these conventions, and it matters who ends up going to Cleveland. Because even if at some point, there's a good chance we're going to go to a second ballot or a third ballot, fourth, depending on how many it takes to get somebody above that. The fascinating aspect there is that there's a good possibility that Trump's going to do really well on that first ballot, although short of the 1,237 he needs. And then on the second ballot, he could do significantly worse, because a lot of the people who were sent there as his delegates aren't, quote unquote, really his delegates, meaning that they're much more sympathetic to Ted Cruz or some other option. The Trump campaign is screaming bloody murder over this, but this is all within the rules. And in fact, what it says is you have to pay attention to these county conventions, these district conventions, these state conventions. And he made this objection to Reince Priebus at his meeting at the RNC last week. And reportedly, Reince Priebus said back, no, this is how it works. You have to pay attention to these state conventions. This is part of the job of your campaign to make sure that your guys are going to Cleveland instead of the other guys. And, according to the New York Times, at least, Trump turned to his people and said, you're not doing your jobs. So maybe there'll be a shakeup in the Trump campaign, or at least they'll be focusing more on this. But look, if you want to know how the party nominates its candidate, it's been so long since we've had a contested convention, we've had a primary like this, that finally everybody's getting a really good look at how the process works in the details. And for Ted Cruz, it's working out really well because it's very clear his team has done their homework and it's paying off so far pretty well for him.
And we'll see what happens in the states to come. So on to the Bad Martini now. And Jim, it was a really good night back in 2010. We had just started the 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Republicans not only scored a resounding victory to take back the House, they came very close in the Senate. They were way, way, way behind in the Senate, but they couldn't quite get the majority, but they made a nice dent. And when it comes to the House of Representatives, we're now finding out that 6 years later, a lot of them just don't want to be there anymore. NPR did a story, and the focus is on Virginia Congressman Scott Rigell, who's down in the Tidewater area. He's leaving after 3 terms. It says Rigell is retiring after just 6 years in Congress. He was one of the 87 Republicans who rode the Tea Party wave to a pivotal GOP takeover of the House. At the end of this Congress, more than 1/3 of that class will be gone from the U.S. House. It says 21 members have already left, although 2 of them now serve in the Senate, Cory Gardner and Tim Scott. Another 8 members of the class are retiring this year. So, Jim, there's a couple different ways to look at this, most of it bad, because a lot of these have been good lawmakers who have done their best to try and move things in the right direction, even though with Obama in the White House and Democrats in control of the Senate and other factors, their own leadership sometimes, things haven't gotten done as quickly or as smoothly as they would have liked to. But we've had good people there for the most part. We hate to see them go. I personally really hate to see them go in a presidential election year because open house seats will be harder to win than probably in a midterm year. At the same time, though, these people see themselves as citizen legislators, not career politicians. And for that, I guess we need to applaud them.
Yeah, I look at this and feel a certain amount of anxiety, a certain sense that maybe 2010 class of House Republicans elected the year, really the first major year of the Tea Party, arguably the strongest year of the Tea Party, didn't quite turn out the way we wanted it to, not just because of Obama's reelection, the inability to repeal Obamacare and things like that. Yes, some of these guys have gone on to the Senate. Some of these guys have gone on to other offices. To me, as much as you might love term limits, to me, if you have a good leader, I want you in the game as much as I can use you. Even if you go to the Senate, you go to the governor's office, you run for some other office, it's good to have you in the political arena. Good talent is you want to hold on to that. Now, some folks might look at it differently and be glad that these guys are going back to private office in some cases. And some of these guys lost races in 2012 and 2014. Not too many in 2014, though. It does kind of have this nagging sense of was this a short-lived revolution? Because of redistricting, the odds are pretty good for Republicans keeping the House for a long road, but not a guarantee. Most people projecting the Republicans are going to lose some House seats in 2016, and it's not unthinkable that they could end up losing control of the House. And you just kind of have this nagging sense that we thought we were on the cusp of something great in 2010, and I think it's not necessarily shook out that way. And the idea of losing a third by now, it just feels like it was, those numbers are dwindling a little faster than we'd like to see shaking out there, Greg. So maybe I'm the pessimistic viewpoint on the Bad Martini today.
On to the crazy martini now, Jim. And Barack Obama, of course, was reelected in 2012. Do you remember the exit poll question that killed Mitt Romney?
Who cares more about people like you?
Exactly. Of course, the Democrats care more about people like you. They care about the downtrodden. They care about reaching out to people. Well, only with your money do they care about doing that. This is a story that the New York Times did back in 1981, and it's come up as a result of Bernie Sanders doing fairly well. So again, this is September 1981 for the kickoff of the 40th annual Chittenden County United Way fundraising drive in Burlington, Vermont. Keep in mind, that's the setting, a fundraising drive. The sponsors consider themselves fortunate to have as guests Mayor Bernard Sanders of Burlington and Governor Richard Snelling of Vermont. But the charity workers heard the sort of things they wanted to hear from only one of their guests. "I don't believe in charities," said Mayor Sanders, bringing a shocked silence to a packed hotel banquet room. The mayor, who is a socialist, went on to question the, quote, fundamental concepts on which charities are based. and contended that government rather than charity organizations should take responsibility for social programs. So charities, government's going to do your work for you. The Washington Post reports that in 2015, Bernie Sanders and his wife hauled in over $200,000 in income. They donated less than 5% of that to charity, some $8,350. On his Vermont tax return, Sanders made a total of $150 in voluntary contributions to support 4 causes: at-risk children, endangered wildlife, military veterans, and the environment. So, Jim, I guess he doesn't want the government to have any competition. Interesting insight into the party in which, if you'll remember, Al Gore, I believe, got caught donating hundreds to charity while he was vice president, and Hillary Clinton was donating used underwear.
I was going to say, I also remember Joe Biden having some embarrassingly low contributions to charity in recent years. Look, on the one hand, this is a personal choice, and it's up to you to decide how much you want to give to charity, whether you want to itemize it on your taxes and things like that. But that comment from Bernie Sanders, and I'm sure he would renounce today, and oh no, I'm sure he loves coffee. But I think it's kind of revealing about that. And then this idea of, we on the right side of the aisle have been saying for a long time that the more government expands its role to take care of the poor, to provide these kinds of services to the needy, the more people feel disinclined to give to charity because, well, that's government's job. Well, there are a couple of things. One is that government, you may have noticed, isn't always the most efficient, well-run, organized, and cost-effective way of dealing with problems like this. And the other thing is that, charities, for better or for worse, whatever their flaws, and there have been some, scandals at charities and bad charities, but charities generally, you're in it for the right reasons. Nobody goes to run, for the most part, you don't go to a charity to make money. You don't go work for a charity because you want to have a great pension for lots of years. You're in it because you believe in the mission. And so the government, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily join the government because you believe in the mission. Hopefully you do. Those who read the Weed Agency will say after a while, people tend to get to realize, well, it's their job. They're going to hang around long enough to collect a pension. They're going to do just enough to get done what they need to. They remember back in 2000 when George W. Bush was running for office, talked about faith-based charities. And they recognized, looking at things like drug addiction and treatment programs, that things that had a religious component tended to get better results than ones that were simply secular. And they realized this was creating this was creating a separation of church and state issue. If you really want to look for what works best, you'd have to put this in the hands of private charity because this is their mission. This is their driving force in life. For government, charity, taking care of the poor is one of many, many duties it's supposed to have. But all of this is just gibberish to Bernie Sanders. He's tired of being expected to give to charity because, by golly, government should be taking care of it. In other eyes, that would be considered callous, and that would be considered greedy, and that would be considered selfish. But it's Bernie Sanders, so we're not going to hear too much of it. I do know that if I were Hillary Clinton, I would be putting that quote in attack ads 24/7, do everything I could to say, don't be fooled by this kindly, disheveled old man. He's got a heart as hard as the coal that he wants to ban.
History and archived quotes. Love it, at least in this situation. Jim, talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks very much for being with us today, and tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.